Hi again. In The Rise of Adventism, edited by Edwin Gaustad, this particular article on Millerism is authored by David Arthur. Arthur has developed the thought that at least in its beginnings in the 1820s and 30s, right through to about 1840, there was no sectarian tendency visible in William Miller's efforts and those of his colleagues. They weren't dividing off from other Christians. But at the end of the last segment, they're getting organized and things will change. So Arthur says, by the last quarter of 1840, the Adventist cause had attained a simple rudimentary organization and had developed a few important institutions. They had published a statement of their essential beliefs. They had established their own press and inaugurated a conference and committee system. In a few short months, they had taken great strides in establishing their identity and their sense of community, and were becoming, in fact, if not in intent, an identifiable group. Nevertheless, J.V. Himes wrote at the end of the conference, "We know no sect or party as such, while we respect all." During the next 2.5 years, the press and the General Conference were to provide the framework and the leadership for an increasingly independent Adventist cause. The second session of the General Conference, held in June 1841 in Lowell, Massachusetts, outlined a specific work for Adventists. Among the recommendations were: 1. Personal conversation with others on religious and especially on the near coming of Christ. Personal conversation with others on religion and especially on the near coming of Christ. 2. The formation of Bible classes for mutual study of the Advent question. 3. Social meetings for prayer and exhortation wherever there was a sufficient number of believers to sustain them. 4. The questioning of ministers on the second Advent, asking them to explain related scriptures. 5. The circulation of books and pamphlets and the provision of funds with which to do this. 6. Remaining within and working within existing churches to bring the church to a better mind. That's a direct quote. Bring the church to a better mind, rather than withdrawing from them and forming a new one. And 7. The establishment of second Advent libraries in every town and village. These recommendations marked a real advance in both the aggressiveness of the Adventist cause and in the formation of a separate identity, while at the same time maintaining that separatism was not their goal. Adventists were to promote their views and question their ministers to their satisfaction. They were not to live and let live, nor were their activities confined to normal church channels. Separate meetings for prayer, preaching, and Bible study were to be set up, and second Advent libraries established everywhere possible. The movement was growing in confidence and gaining momentum. Yet doubts remained among many Adventists. Were they striking out on a course too independent? Were they in danger of forming another church? When shortly after the General Conference, the Signs of the Times, that is the publication they had begun, announced that Josiah Litch had been appointed general agent of the movement by the Committee on Publication, concern was expressed lest they be charged with forming a new church. The appointment was thus made temporary, to last only until the next conference session, quote, "when the brethren will make such arrangements as will most speedily accomplish the work before us," end of quote. There is no record of action taken at the next General Conference session. Litch, however, soon returned to his previous work as a prominent but individual lecturer for the cause. At the third conference session, held in Portland, Maine, in October 1841, William Miller, though not in attendance, recommended by letter a bold new step, that of creating a committee for the purpose of examining, advising, and recommending lecturers. Here's a direct quote from Miller. We all have our work to do, but all have not the same work. Therefore God has set everyone in his own place, and every man in his own work. The great object of every one of us ought to be not to covet everyone the same gift, but to covet earnestly the best gift for which we are qualified by the great head of the church. Some apostles, prophets, teachers, helps, and governments. The greatest difficulty is in determining which is our work, We are all of us so liable to be prejudiced in our own favor that it becomes a matter of some difficulty to know and keep the place in the vineyard which God calls us to fill. I would therefore suggest the propriety of the brethren of the conference giving counsel, advice, and recommendation to those who they may, in their judgment, believe qualified for public teachers. I would suggest also one thing, which I believe would be a benefit to our cause, that a committee be appointed for the express purpose of examining, advising, and recommending said lecturers by the conference. That sounds suspiciously like what we call a seminary. And then Arthur goes on, despite Miller's urging, the report of the conference indicates that no action was taken. Adventism was not ready for the step of identifying a qualified ministry. The problem of recognizing and recommending teachers and preachers remained. At a general conference held in November 1841 in Low Hampton, New York, William Miller, who was chairing the gathering, witnessed the passing of a resolution which recommended to the Adventist believers that, quote, Brethren Miller, Himes, Litch, Jones, and Ward, together with those according with them in sentiment and associated with them in effort, are entitled to the confidence, prayers, and cooperation of all those who love the glorious appearing of the great God and our Savior Jesus Christ. End of quote. Here the leaders were successful in identifying themselves and recommending those who agreed with them in idea and action. A standard had been established against which to measure other men and their views. In 1842, another institution was developed in certain cities for the purpose of furthering the Adventist cause. This was the Second Advent Association. The first, organized in New York City, declared that they had, quote, associated for the purpose of strengthening and comforting each other with those truths, and in every practical way to disseminate knowledge in the subject, and to strive by all means to promote the glory of God. End of quote. Members were required to pay monthly sums. A hall was rented in which they held worship services on Sunday afternoon, thus avoiding the regular worship hour of the churches. Officers were elected and Bible classes held. By the end of 1843, most of the larger cities had such groups. The members usually maintained their connections with their churches. But the establishment of these associations was another step in the movement toward a separate and a distinct existence. From mid-1842 until the Great Disappointment of October 1844, the time question held center stage in the thinking of the Millerites and their opponents. Before the summer of 1842, the question of when Christ would return had taken second place to the declaration of the fact of his return. The nature of the event, what would actually occur, was more ardently stressed than the exact time. On the question of time, there was much disagreement. Miller himself expected the end about 1843. About 1843 is his phrase. And Josiah Litch agreed with Miller. Henry Dana Ward and Henry Jones, the other leaders, were from the beginning opposed to time setting and were never won over to it. J.V. Himes remained rather indifferent to the question of exact time. An activist rather than a theorist, the possibility that Christ might return about 1843 was enough to lead him on, while leaving the exact time an open question. In this way, the five most prominent Millerite lecturers were divided, and the columns of the Signs of the Times carried the same variety of opinion. The debate was not to continue. At the General Conference held in Dover, New Hampshire, in December 1841, it was stated by the chairman that it was necessary only for members to declare their belief in the near advent of Christ, that a belief in a definite time was not necessary. At the conference session held the following May in Boston, the issue was forced, along with the related questions of the millennium and the Jews' return to Palestine. The Committee on Finance and the Roll declared that the midnight cry should be made in unequivocal terms, believing as we do that God has revealed not only the manner, but also the time of Christ's second advent. Your committee are fully of the opinion that the time has now come when the conference should distinctly avow this sentiment to the world and urge it with double diligence upon all men." End of quote. While not mentioning the year 1843 specifically, the committee recommended that only persons who rejected the doctrines of the temporal millennium, the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, and who believed the second advent of Christ to be the next great event in history, be invited to enroll their names as members of the conference. The true intention and sense of the conference was even more clearly revealed in the resolutions which were passed, condemning the idea of a temporal millennium, rejecting the idea that the Jews would return to Jerusalem, and most importantly, stating the belief that Christ would return in 1843. The last mentioned resolution stated, quote, "Whereas it is as readily and clearly determined that the visions of Daniel carry us down to the end of the world and the coming of Christ, as the meaning of any portion of the Old Testament can be determined by the New Testament, and whereas it is the only fair conclusion at which we can arrive that the periods contained in these visions give the time of the accomplishment of these great events, and whereas from the only date given for the commencement of those periods, no other terminations can be found for them than 1843, and whereas those who oppose this view of the question do not pretend to give any other solution to these portions of prophecy, therefore resolved that in the opinion of the conference there are most serious and important reasons for believing that God has revealed the time of the end of the world, and that that time is 1843. It goes on, but we'll leave till next time how these things came to divide not only the five leaders, but the Millerite movement in general as the day approached and the day passed. I'll put in a link to two videos we've done from the work of Dwight Wilson, who has written a book called Armageddon Now, a wonderful study of this period of Adventist history. Not just Adventist history, though. He takes the history right into the 20th century with four more generations of prophetic speculation after World War I. Disappointed not only Jehovah's Witnesses, but many evangelicals and Adventists. So that's Dwight Wilson, Armageddon Now. I'll put a link to the first of those two videos on your screen.